Anupam is a professor of economics at the Takshashila Institution, where, among lots of other things, he teaches economic reasoning and macroeconomics. He is famous for the witty columns he writes in some of the world's best editorials, and recently co authored a book, We the Citizens, that decodes India's public policy through a comic like format. He is one of India's loudest advocates for free markets and believes that price controls are never justified.
Hi, Anupam. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Deepak. I am absolutely thrilled to be here.
Okay. So, Anupam, a few years ago, when I was still a student, I was in Chennai meeting for something we were doing with the company. And the meeting ended early. I had a few hours to kill before I could take a train back home. And we had nothing to do. And at that time, we realized that the local theater was offering tickets for all movies, irrespective of what type of movie it was, at 120 rupees per ticket. And two poor students, friend of mine and myself, were able to watch a movie that day simply as a consequence of the price being controlled on theaters, on what they can charge for a ticket for a movie. So there are two ways to place this question. One, is this fundamentally problematic? Somebody who would never have viewed the movie otherwise is now being able to view it because the prices are controlled. And two, why do you hate poor people?
Fantastic. So, I love all people. No, I never thought I would say that. No, that's not even true. But I do care about the welfare of most people. Let me put it that way. And it is because I care about the welfare of most people would I argue very strongly against the form of price control that you have mentioned, right? Um, we have to look at what is price controls, why do they exist, and all of that. But if we just talk about movie tickets, Tamil Nadu has this idea that they have put an externally placed limit, right, on what is the maximum amount theater owners can charge for movie tickets, right? So that's what a price control is, right, where the government comes in, sets an artificial kind of limits on what the price can be. It can be a higher limit, right, which is what we would call as a price ceiling, or it can be a lower limit saying this is a price floor, right? So
Yeah.
they can set either way. So a price floor would basically set how low the price can be, right? So this is obviously set above the market equilibrium price, and a price ceiling basically says how high the price can be, and this is usually below the market equilibrium price, because if it was at the market equilibrium price, or it makes no sense. So these are artificially placed limits, right? Now, why would you do that? Sometimes the government would say, okay, the price of a particular good is far too much, people can't afford it, and therefore they'll step in and say, no, no, it can't be that much, we will set a limit as to how high it can be. Or the other way around, sometimes products which, let's say, they don't approve of, they say the price of that is too low, so therefore people are consuming it too much, and so therefore they will bring in a price floor. Or in other cases, they're basically picking winners, right? All of this has to do with picking winners. So in other cases, they pick winners, saying, okay, no, no, these sets of people are earning far too less or getting too less, so therefore we will set that can't be the price, and we'll set a particular limit as to how low that can be, and they'll come in. So these are generally what you would call as price floors and price ceilings. They basically, it is interference by the government on how high or low a price can be, and therefore they'll set those limits. Now let's go back to your theater example, right? Firstly, I find it cute that you think that the government owes you the opportunity to watch a movie, right? Why do we think that the government is under any obligation, or society is under any obligation, to ensure that you get to watch movies? And when I say you, of course, I'm generalizing this across population to say, why is it the obligation of society to ensure that people have the rights to watch movies in the first place? I don't think anybody is under any such obligation. So, as far, and I know maybe later down, in this episode, we might talk about things like life-saving drugs and so on, where at least I might agree that the society is under an obligation to ensure that you don't die because of lack of access to medicine. For things like movies, I would immediately push back and say there is absolutely no obligation to ensure that you get to watch movies, right? Anybody, for example, because I will push that example right out of it. This thing, maybe use reductio ad absurdism and say, similarly, I should have the right to own a Mercedes Benz. So why not put price caps on Mercedes, right? And say, society should be under obligation that Anupam should have a Mercedes. and so therefore put price caps on Mercedes, saying you can't sell a car about 2 lakhs. Why not? I mean, go for it, right? So obviously that won't
Yeah.
happen.
So
And why?
let's expand on that. I mean, I hear you. Why not? Why should we not have a? I'm trying to figure out, at least for listeners to start off, what the ripple effects are. So let's say you have a price cap on Mercedes cars, or cars in general, I suppose is how we do it. Or you go pre 91. There's only one type of car, and that's the whole world you live in. And there's a set price. Ripple effects sound like.
Yeah, of course, it's going to be a whole range of favor. But I mean, I'm going to play this little bit of game, right? Let's imagine that they do put a price cap, right? That you can't sell a car above 2 lakh rupees. Deepak, what do you think will happen?
From all the reading I've done on the subject, and also what seems completely logical, the demand for cars stays exactly like it stays,
No,
and demand and supply.
It should up,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
and yeah, or it goes up from here. Yeah, because now the number of people who can afford a car significantly goes up. But we have and I think you'll end up struggling with supplying enough cars. So you'll have long wait times. I think pre 91 we saw this, where
yeah. So
I
if you
remember someone
look
telling
at
me that you'd have to wait. It was actually more expensive to buy a second-hand Maruti car than a first-hand car, because you'd get it immediately if you bought a second-hand car versus buying a new one. Or you'd buy one now for a dowry that is due in 6 years, right? In that world. So yeah, those are possibly the sort of ripple effects that I can see happen as a consequence.
the first thing that will happen is you will have real kind of distortions in the market. So you'll either have crazy excesses in the case of a price floor, or crazy kind of shortages in the case of a price ceiling. So when you say you can't charge higher than this, all those cars which were being produced and where the cost is more than this and were being sold at a price higher than whatever price cap they this, they'll just disappear from the market, right? Because they'll say, okay, why should I sell at a loss? And you immediately agree with that. Why should anybody be forced to sell at a loss, right?
Of course.
So they won't do that, right? So Mercedes Benz will just exit the India market and say we'll sell elsewhere. Any other car, I mean, I'm just saying Mercedes, but any other car which is above, which was costing above the hypothetical kind of price control, will just exit the market because they don't want to sell. Now you're left with a bunch of cars which were anyway below that market price, right? Which are anywhere below
Yeah.
that market price. So that is what will continue being sold, which means now with the stroke of a pen, you've massively reduced consumer choice, right? Earlier, if I wanted, I could have bought a Mercedes Benz, and at the same time, I could have bought a Tata Nano. Whereas now, if you put that price cap anywhere, I don't know, 2 lakhs, 3 lakhs, 4 lakhs, etc., I'm now forced to buy only things which are below 4 lakhs, because that will only be the only set of choices that I have. Everybody else has exited the market. So what you've done is completely removed consumer choice. And if you agree with me that consumer choice is the bedrock of welfare, right? Which is that, welfare comes from having choice, right? And so you're removing one essential part of it. So you're removing my choice. You've automatically reduced the welfare that me and a million other customers already face. But that's just the part of it, right? Now, the second thing that will immediately happen is that it's not that, everybody will just exit the market. If somebody finds it truly lucrative, they will find other ways to sell, right? And these other
Yes.
ways to sell can be, it can be through innovative methods, it can be through illegal methods, it can be through anything else in between. So, for example, they could say the price cap applies to the car, which might be the chassis plus engine plus something, right? But it does
Yeah.
not apply to service, right? So then they'll say, okay, we will not service your car unless you buy pre-ordered whatever service from us, right? And that miraculously will cost 10 lakhs. Or they'll say, yes, the car is free and you just get bare skeleton, as in basically just steel frames for seats. But if you want cushions, you have to buy only Mercedes licensed cushions or Maruti licensed cushions, and that
Yep.
will cost whatever, right? And so you make up the difference through that, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you can find a whole bunch of ways in which you can make that up, right? So that's what will happen. Or the other way around, none of this is true. Mercedes exits the market, but then you have to import it either legally or illegally from some other country, and then a black market for Mercedes Benz cars will reopen, right? All of that will happen. Let's take the movie example. What do you think will happen? So for me, I immediately see that if there's a price cap on movies, let's say 120, 140 rupees. Bangalore, by the way, famously tried this. Bangalore had a price cap on movies. It was a sham and a half, right? Because they said that movie tickets can't charge more than whatever they pick 200, 250 rupees, something of that
Yeah.
sort. And then they said, you can't charge higher than that. um, I think this is why I say, good ideas require justification all the time. You need to keep justifying, this is a good idea, please do it. Whereas bad ideas just are highly contagious, they move around very quickly, right? And so this is the thing, Bangalore kind of copied the Tamil Nadu model, and we said, okay, we're going to have price caps on movie tickets. And what happened was very interesting. I mean, it's a beautiful case study in and of itself. Immediately the cost of all kinds of complementary goods shot up, right? So if,
Yep.
as it is, popcorn and Coke costs a lot, and now it just doubled, tripled in price, right? So the cost of popcorn will go up, the cost of cola will go up, the cost of parking in theaters might go up, right? And then they, of course, will not allow you to bring your own food, because you have not even water, because you have to buy from them, and that they will charge higher, etc., etc. So all of those things will go up, and that is one way to kind of make up the revenue. The second way to make up revenue would be that or the other way to kind of cut costs is that, and we've seen this happen in many other instances, where the quality of those things will come down. So your seats will no longer be nice, it'll be rickety, it'll be dusty. You might not employ 10 people to clean up the theater. As soon as the show ends, you might find garbage all around. You'll find that the recliner in the seats don't work really well. It is dusty, it might have what is that, bed bugs kind of thing, which will bite you. A whole bunch of those things. The loos are now not clean and spick and span, which is what malls are known for. There's stinky toilets, there are whatever, right? Maintenance goes down, right? You might have a leaky pipe and so on. All of that will go down, because obviously they're trying to now cut costs. If you can't raise revenue, you're going to try and cut costs. So that's something that immediately theater owners will try and do. And I think we've seen those things happen as well. The third aspect is, of course, if there are price controls, again, let's say there's a Rajnikant movie coming up, right? I don't know if it still holds the same sway as before. I don't know. You
It
take
certainly
Rajnikant,
does.
or you take Avengers movie that's coming out. It's a weekend blockbuster, and there's a huge demand for it. So the willingness to pay from people might be 1,000 rupees, 1,500 rupees, but the official price is 120 rupees. What do you suppose will happen?
Yeah, you'd never get a ticket. It'll always be full. Makes no sense for the. Of course, I hear you. In fact, any common sense listener instinctively understands what the problem is, right? But I think the example at least serves as a way to explain price floors, price ceilings, and the typical common sense problems that arise from
Yeah.
price controls that are centrally mandated.
Yeah.
So I think
let me just
please.
Just if it's not clear, right? If people are willing to pay 1,500, I mean, we've heard of cases where people pay up to 5k, 10k for the first day, first show kind of thing for Rajnikant, right? They're really crazy fans. And if the official price is at 120 rupees, and if I have 8 hours to spare, I will go stand in the line, and I will make sure that I buy like 15 or 20 of those tickets, and then buy it at 120 rupees and then sell it at this thing. I've immediately created a thriving black market, right, for that. Now, once I have those tickets, of course, it can get violent, because somebody can come beat me up. So then I hire thugs, and I've increased violence, I've increased this thing, and I've taken, and this is my biggest problematic area, Deepak, and I want to bring it in very early on. I have taken what otherwise would be a completely, perfectly legitimate economic transaction, that is a person wanting to watch a movie, and created a ring of violence, of rent seeking, of corruption, and ultimately of lawlessness and so on. So I've taken perfectly morally upright, law abiding citizens and made them into criminals just because of a law. And for me, that is the most deeply kind of disturbing aspect of something like a price control. So now a person who just wants to watch a movie of their favorite star has indulged in essentially a criminal activity, right?
Which is buying a ticket on the black market.
Which is buying a ticket in the black market, right? It's seemingly this thing, but it is a criminal activity. You might get caught, which means then a police officer might come and say, okay, what are you doing? A constable might come, and therefore you might have to pay off that guy. You've increased corruption. You think police don't know about this? Of course they know. They're in on it, right? So these rackets don't get hidden for long. So then they get paid. Somebody else comes, they get paid, and then now you've created an entire machinery of corruption, black market, violence, whole bunch of those things. And this is just the starting point. This is the tip of the iceberg. The ill effects of something like a price control runs very deep. And I hope to take an example later on about stents and what can happen.
Yeah.
Where I will explain how deep the rot can go.
Yeah. So this is high seen and the unseen, right? The scene is well-intentioned price control so that you and I can watch a movie at a theater. The unseen is all of the horrible things you just described being the tip of the iceberg. However, because this is a podcast where I disagree with you, I'm going to try and I think the example with the theater is a well-functioning, stable market, no real disruptions except for the odd Rajnikant movie, and so I can see how it is quite illogical, and maybe logic is not the only tool I want to use in trying to poke holes at this, to impose price controls there, and I think the first example I want to jump into is some form of a market failure. So a good way to lay the scenario would be there is a tsunami or an earthquake, or an avalanche of some sort, and supply chains to a small village on top of a mountain with 50,000, 100,000 residents has been disrupted. The state simply does not have the capacity to fly in more goods and supplies. Supply chains that are privately run are fundamentally broken. I can't bring more milk, for example, into that space. Now, if we, yeah,
Deepak, if I may just interrupt, I mean, I don't think we need to construct an exaggerated version, hypothetical exaggerated version. Let's take the Chennai floods of about
perfect.
2013, if I'm not forget, if I'm correct. There was very severe kind of floods in Chennai in 2013. All of the things that you said were true. Supply
Yeah.
chains were broken. For example, milk prices shot up from, I think at that point of time it was 25 rupees a liter, whereas it was being sold at 200 rupees a liter. And so these are very real kind of effects that happen. All of the things that you were saying happened in Chennai at that point of time, right? So
So I was in Chennai then. In fact, 2013, I was in the middle of the floods at the time. Yeah. Okay. So here's I'm going to try and construct a question, and then we'll try and dissect it. We know that we have limited supply of, let's say, milk as an example, right? There is only so much milk, which effectively means that only so many people are going to get it. If there was enough milk, that everybody who wanted X quantity would get it, then we wouldn't have a pricing problem. And we have two choices to make. On one side, you can say the market remains free, and those who can pay for the milk will pay for it. So it may be that I queue up, and then I'm well off, but maybe not that well off. I don't need a liter, but I need half a liter. And so you and I get together and say, okay, we'll bear half each, buy half a liter each, so we can get through the day and want life. So that's one way the world works. Either the rich or rich adjacent. So those who have the sort of capital to spare to purchase that good or product at that price are the ones who receive that supply. And on the other hand, you could make a moral case that it should be first come first serve. If you can pay MRP, which I know is a trigger word, but if you can pay the price that used to be, then first come first serve is who gets the good or service. Now, in this case, I'm sure that the immediate counter is something like hoarding, where if it's just $20 and I know that everybody wants milk, then I'm going to buy it and then resell it on a black market or hoard it and nobody else gets milk. So I think that the state in this case would say something like there is a price control on milk and a unit count for the number of things. If it's a an integer number of things that you can buy, only a number of things that you can buy. Now there are two sort of, I would also say, moral positions here. Morally, who should get the milk? That's sort of the question that the state is attempting to answer, and it seems like, at least intentionally, the response that they're giving is it should not be those who have the money to pay for it. It should be those on a first come first serve basis, right? Those who queue up first get the milk first, and the spike in price should not affect them. That's broadly what it seems like the state is saying. One more small aside is, this does not immediately impact the business person. I understand it impacts the next batch of milk, but the business person has procured milk, at least the state would say, at X per liter or whatever. I bought those packets of milk. I'm going to sell it at 20% hike, which I've always done and will continue to do. So the business person is not bearing a loss at this point, probably on future supply that isn't coming in. Right? But at this point, on this batch, the business person is not making a loss. Okay. So these are two sort of model polls. Why pick the richest first versus the first come first serve?
okay, so I think we are firmly in the near philosophical territory, right? And I love this because um even before getting to the floods, and I think you might have to just steer me through this conversation
Sure.
a little bit because I might go all over the place. But the fundamental question of economics by itself is how to allocate, right?
Yeah.
um who What do you produce, how much of it do you produce, how do you produce it, then who do you distribute it to, how do you distribute, who gets it, and so on. These are like the fundamental questions of economics, right? And the only way, there are multiple ways to allocate. So let's forget the how do you produce questions, right? Because all of them have the same answer in economics, which is price. But leave that out for the moment, and we'll say, okay, how do you allocate scarce resources? So you have something scarce, let's say milk, right? And what how do you allocate this? Now, normally the criticism thrown against economics is that economics picks the answer which is the most efficient,
Yes.
whereas we might not want the most efficient answer, but we want the fairest answer. I will argue, hopefully, through the next 5 minutes, that the two are not very different. That the most efficient also happens to be the fairest. Okay. So, how do you allocate? What are the different ways in which you can allocate? You can try and divide everything equally, right? So, you have 10 packets of, I don't know, whatever, 10 gallons of 10 liters, 10 tons. I don't even know what what the measure is, but 10 units, right? Large units of milk. And you have 10,000 people, and you basically divide that amongst the 10,000 people. Now, this might mean that every person who needs it gets few drops, which is absolutely useless. It might also mean that a lot of people who don't want milk gets it. A lot of people who need a lot of milk get very little. I don't think that's fair in any way. Second thing, you could say, okay, yeah, it's a lottery system. Now, lottery system is not fair. I mean, it's a lottery. Maybe you get it, maybe you don't. Again, maybe the lactose intolerant person will get a lot of milk, and the baby who needs milk for survival will not get it. Right? Again, I don't think it's fair. What are the other ways that you can think of? One is first come first serve, as you said. Now, first come first serve is interesting. Um, Maybe it's fair, but I would say it's actually, I would continue my assertion that it's actually highly unfair, because one, it's a matter of who has the highest amount of time. So who has the least opportunity cost of time, right? Now, this need not be the person who needs milk the most. It's just the person who has the least opportunity cost of time. They can stand in line. The bigger problem, Deepak, as you might very easily imagine, is it also equates equally to who has the most amount of resources. So while you might not need, so what I will do is I will pay somebody to stand in the line if I'm the rich person, right? And therefore I will get my milk, and I will, and now that it's at a low price, I will do that. Or, as I say, it can be an entrepreneurial set of folks. Now, you can put unit limits, etc., but if there's 10 friends of mine and we are all college, whatever, students, college is shut, I will all stand in line, each person will get 3 units, and then I will sell it at a much higher price. Black markets are almost inevitable in this scenario, right? So again, does that mean it's fair? No, because the person who really needs it ends up paying a lot more for it. Correct. So I don't think that is necessarily good as well. You could have another method, which is just some authority deciding. Right? I am the god. I will decide, Deepak, you don't need milk. Whatever, Anupam, you require this much milk, and I'll give. But it now is almost, for me, as arbitrary as anything else, because now you're putting your entire faith in the judgment and goodwill of this particular authoritarian figure. Now, that authoritarian figure might very well decide that his friend should get all the milk because he deserves it, right? Equally too, equal probability of that happening. Or we can make really random decisions and say, oh, my community should get most milk, somebody else should not get, whatever, their biases will come through. Again, I don't think it's fair. For me, the fairest way is actually through the pricing mechanism, right? It is the fairest way through the pricing mechanism, because the people who value it the most are the people who will have the highest willingness to pay,
If they have the money.
if they have the money. Now, we'll come to that, right? If they have the money, but the willingness to pay is the highest amongst the people who need it the most. Now, what will happen? Now, let's take something like the Chennai case, right? Let's actually think through what would happen, right? Let's say there's a whole bunch of people. Person A uses milk for making lattes, right? Who wants milk in their coffees and who want to make fancy lattes. Person B probably wants chocolate milkshake. Person C wants it for their child, for their survival. Person D is an old person who can't have nutrition from other sources, who requires milk, so on and so forth. Now, income across all of these people, again, is randomized. It's no guarantee that person A has more money than person B. It's randomized, right? We don't know the income distribution, but the chances are that the people who need milk the most will have the highest willingness to pay. That is, at the margin, unless person A and B who wants to make milkshake, right, are the richest people in that planet. Maybe it is the case, maybe it's not the case, right? But at least a whole bunch of those type of people will drop out of the market. They're saying, you know what, I can drink black coffee for the next 5 days. You know what, I don't need to make milkshakes in the next 5 days, right? I can live without it. Or I don't need to make whatever paisam and something else and so on, right? They can
Right.
live without all of that.
So supply will fall basically. Sorry, demand will fall.
Demand will automatically fall because there's a shortage, right? Because the price has gone up, right? Because if you leave it to the pricing system, there's a very near shortage. There's a very clear shortage, and because of the shortage, demand, prices shot up, and because prices shot up, demand will fall. Supply, for now, let's imagine that it remains constant, but I'll come to that, right? So when one of the crazy things which people don't realize is that if the price of an essential commodity shoots up during a calamity, it's not that the market is not functioning. In fact, that is the very definition of a well-functioning market. I would say the market is functioning very well there, right? And that's how it's supposed to function as well. I know it seems like a controversial, counterintuitive thing to say, but that says that, listen, the market is responding to the situation. It's adaptive, it's flexible, it's dynamic, right? You clearly have a supply, what do you call it, a supply shock, and the market is reacting to that supply shock. The prices have gone up. And once the price have gone up, as I said, many of the people on the margin, they might still be an Ambani or so who will still say, you know what, I don't care what the price goes up to, right? I will still purchase, but there's only limited number of those Ambanis. Most people will say, relatively, I would say well-to-do people will drop off at saying, it's okay, I don't need that. I might as well use that money for some other luxury perhaps, right? If things are flooded, I might pay that much money to somebody else to, clean out the water from my apartment, or I might just rent a hotel somewhere else, a whole bunch of things that I can do, right? Even a rich person has competing uses of their money. I think I want people to understand this, that it's not that their wealth is not infinite. Their willingness to pay is not infinite, right? So it will go down. Now, what that automatically means that once the demand starts adjusting, it's good because prices start adjusting. Now, the first thing that we have to recognize is none of this is a single window game. None of this is a single level game, right? It's a multi-level game, right? A multi-iterative kind of game. So what I mean by that is, how did that supply of milk come in the first place? It doesn't appear by magic. If supply chains are broken, it means now let's look at the other side, right? I want to look at the other side. It means that somebody has taken an extraordinary amount of risk to move from place A to this flooded place, bought in the milk. They may be driven through flooded waters. They may be taken some kind of risk, saying I can make. And why are they doing that? They're doing that out of self-interest. They're doing that because they can make a profit.
No, I hear you. Sorry, but in this example, I want to talk about supply of milk that already exists in the city, having been procured prior to.
Yeah. So in that example, as I said, very clearly, demand drops off, right? People who don't want it for absolute essentials will drop off. There are other people who need it. Maybe they're not the richest people, doesn't matter, but they really require it. So they will pay a higher amount for it, right? And they're willing to pay a higher amount for it, and they will do so, right? So they will.
So just to close off this bracket, right? I think that what somebody on the other side would say, what the state would say in a situation like this is, they'd say that it is unacceptable, immoral, perhaps even evil, that there is even one child who were to go hungry for milk, if any of the milk is being bought for a milkshake. That is, even if and so and if the reason the child has not been able to get the milk is because the price was too high for that particular family to afford. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm glad you said that. Now, if you put a price cap, the probability of the milk going for the milkshake shoots up, whatever, 10x, 100x extra, because now everybody can afford it. Now it's no longer about trying to disincentivize people from using the milk for seemingly frivolous purposes. Right now, again, we are no judges of what is frivolous and what is essential. We should never be. Nobody should be. Maybe that person requires milkshake for their, I don't know, whatever, survival. We don't know, right? We don't care. Because the only way to judge people's actions and their preferences to pay is through the pricing system, right? Otherwise, as I said, if you put a price cap, there is a guarantee that the milk will be used for frivolous purposes because it's now affordable for everybody. And there's a much, much, much higher chance that number of babies who will be starved because of the lack of milk will be much higher than in the case of a free market. I'm
Right.
absolutely convinced of it, because you have to see the logic of this, right?
Yeah.
Once you put a price cap, everybody can afford it. So it's no longer about the people who need it the most getting it, right? It means that the number of, again, so people who will just buy it because there's a price cap and who'll use it for a whole bunch of things, maybe. And usually what happens is hoarding. They'll say, I don't know what happens day after tomorrow. Maybe I need my milkshake day after tomorrow, so let me buy it and hold it now because there's a price cap, right? So even in the existing scenario with no additional supply already procured, people will just buy it and hold it, and it becomes lottery. I mean, it can become lottery, it can become first come first serve, it can become even violence. I mean, people who have the most
Yes.
muscle power, or political power or political connections, we don't know, right? Those are the people who will end up getting it. So
But
whenever
I
you have
think
a price
that
cap,
yeah,
it's
no, I
not
hear
just
you. But would the likelihood of violence not go up if the free market were to play in such a way that the price is just exorbitant? Because I understand what you're saying. On one side, you have a tip to violence because there's hoarding, a black market, the protection of the black market, so on and so forth. But on the other side, you could have a tip to violence simply because the price is so high that I can never afford it. I desperately need that good or service, and so three of my friends and I gang up and we say, okay, we're going to raid this place.
yeah, pretty much. So I will not take that away. I think you can have that bit which is working, but I'm saying, when you have, I mean, we've just historical example tells us that while if the prices goes up far too much, there could be chances of, let's say, thieving, a little bit of violence, etc. But on the other hand, we know that when there is price caps, it leads to massive shortages, and when it leads to massive shortages, you have long queues. Remember Venezuela, right? I mean, you have to remember those images of Venezuela, which is haunting. It should haunt people. Long queues, and then ultimately you go to the supermarket, there's nothing left, and there's like few crumbs left, and people fight over it. Ordinary people fight over it, right? That can happen. So the price, uh, allowing the price system to work naturally works. See, I think what I'm trying to say is this, right? What is the essential, I mean, now we're taking even a step back, Deepak, so you have to stop me. But what is the essential role of price even? It does two things, right? Price acts as an incentive, which I think people understand, that price basically, this demand and supply essentially means that prices act as an incentive. Price goes up, demand will fall. Price goes up, supply will increase, right? So that's the standard kind of demand and supply model. So it's, that's acting as an incentive. But the second part, which is equally important, is price acts as a signal, right? Now, what is that signal? So you're now sending a signal saying, listen, this is scarce, this is no longer freely available, and everybody can't have it. So now people will drop off, and then, crucially, now can I bring in the external players?
You mean people importing? Yeah, there I fully hear you, right? Because their prices have shot up. So the price, the good. I mean, I can see how one may argue the position you've taken. I'm trying to construct a very tight frame here. I'm saying in the case of a market failure, which itself is a question, do those things occur? I mean,
It's not even a market failure. I'm pushing back. I'm saying this
yeah,
is
yeah,
not.
that's what. Yeah,
This is a market functioning highly efficiently. In fact, it
correct.
is
Yeah.
functioning, and it is fair, in that sense, because now, okay, so let's take that at the margin, right? So I'm saying there is a case where, let's say, a mother doesn't have infinite wealth, or is not
Yes.
very wealthy, and needs to feed her child some milk which they bought, right? Or children, maybe, whatever, right? Even in that case, there is no, what you've done is at least given a chance for that mother to procure milk, which I am saying would never exist when you had a price control.
Simply because the mother may not have made it to the queue in time, or the milkshake types will be there first because they have excess. Yeah.
The big criticism is that when you have a free market system, it's the wealthy who will corner the market, right? Because they have a higher kind of disposable income, and they
Yes.
have higher, maybe, propensity to consume, so therefore they will just buy up all of the things, right? Whereas in a price controlled system, you are saying that, oh, not you, but the proponents of it would say that, people can go and buy it. I'm actually arguing the opposite, that in a controlled system, the wealthy, because there are a finite number of wealthy people, there's a finite amount of wealth that they would want to spend on every kind of resources. They Even the most wealthy will not want to buy milk at 200, 250, 300, 450, whatever kind of price, right? They will not do that. They will say, okay, you know what, I can live without the milk. So there will be this, there are some people who will do it. Again, it's a dynamic thing. There are some people who will buy it irrespective of the cost, but there's only a limited number of those people. Now you've at least ensured that there's availability of that milk for the poorest people, right? There's availability. That's the first step. In the other system, there's not even availability, because in that, the cornering happens a lot more fiercely, because once you've introduced that kind of price control system, you're almost introducing lawlessness, you're introducing shortages. And so when there is shortages, and there's a very clear incentive for people to take advantage of that situation, right? You will have thugs who will do it, who will corner the market, or you'll have a black market, etc. Whereas in a price control, in a free market kind of system, that incentive doesn't exist. That because you can't make a profit from hoarding milk, you can't make a profit from taking it and then reselling
Right.
it, etc. So at least you've removed those incentives. You're now only incentivizing people, or you're creating a system where people will only buy it for their own consumption. So if they don't feel the need to consume it, they will let it go. They will not
Right.
buy it. So there's a higher availability. Now, yes, there is a chance that people cannot afford it. Right? There's a chance that people cannot afford. That, for me, is where the state can come in. That is where the state can come in. So instead of imposing price controls, can you, for example, the state, offer money to people who want it, offer some kind of direct benefit transfer, offer some kind of other subsidy. Maybe they can procure it themselves, and then distribute it according to some idea. I mean, that for me is the least preferred option, but even that option exists. But I'm saying any of these is better than putting a price control.
To actually push back, I mean, I'm making the case on your behalf because I'm thinking about from that angle as well. I think that private philanthropy fills the gap in a lot of these places, right?
Yes, I'm not even come to that. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
The second bit now, which is why I have to bring in now the outsiders, Deepak. Okay, you can't
Yes,
keep
let's
them
do
out. You can't keep them out.
Okay, let's do it. Sorry, but before I miss the point that I want to make, still I'm trying to find loopholes in all of this, right? So I'm still wondering if from a very Lockean standpoint, the existence of the state primarily is not to worry about price or any of that, right? The state's job is to defend your rights and mine. Let's say that's a libertarian way to look at the role of the state. If the protection of my property and my bodily rights by way of violence were to be threatened as a consequence of a scarcity in resources, would that justify price controls to decrease the probability of violence such that my private property, my body, and my physical
Absolutely
property
not.
are protected? That's sort of the tight frame that I was trying to. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, so you cannot do price controls as a way to defend rights. So firstly, because then what you're doing is you're taking away one right, the right to, freedom to manage your trade, to economic freedom, your right to even private property. Because if
Yes.
that milk, I have bought that milk, I have a right to sell it at whatever price I
Yeah.
want. So you're then taking away that right and giving me some other. So I do not agree with that framing at all. At best, what you can do is, of course, as if you're saying defend rights, you can do it through the law and order situation. So now, by the way, when you put price controls, you will end up spending quite a bit of your state resources on imposing those price controls. Instead, you use that same resources on, managing law and order as you would, and take away the chance of violence.
Got it. So it's the sort of state capacity that's more defense heavy, like protection of rights heavy, as opposed to top-down imposition of price controls heavy. Okay, I hear what you're saying. Now you can bring in imports from the outside, but I think here we already agree, right? Because it's hard for me to fight off a price control argument once people have spent enormous amounts of money to bring those goods and services in. So if you're okay with it, I'd actually like to pivot to a second sort of, go on if you had something to add.
It's just I want to finish that, right? Because
Sure.
the price acting as a signal is the most important thing.
Hmm.
Because it's just in the first level, the first game is where you have limited supply and all of this demand. But once you have the situation where where clearly you're saying people are buying at exorbitant rates, let's say the 35 instead of 25 rupees, people are willing to pay 200 rupees, immediately all the entrepreneurs or mini entrepreneurs who are living on just let's say the borders of Chennai, from Hosur and from Salem and from Erode and so on, will say, listen, it's an opportunity to make money, right? So they will buy milk from all of these places. They'll brave the elements, go there, sell it. Supply will automatically increase. Prices will come down. Demand now the marginal player who wants to use milk for his tea will also get this thing, right? And what you've done is that the market takes care of itself. And this is not a hypothetical scenario. This is a very real life scenario. And the third bit is that we you don't always have to rely on either just the market, which is this way functioning, and this thing. In cases such as the flood, the society really comes together, right? We've seen a lot of people doing voluntary work who will
Yeah.
share their milk, who will buy it even at a higher cost and then share it with others. I mean, we have, if in cases like that we don't believe in humanity, right? Then I don't know where else, right? And we've seen that happen. People have done enormous, I mean, just our alumni, Deepak, GCPP people, I know that they've created an entire large group of volunteers who did all of this, who coordinated from clothes to or something else. Also, that happens, right? So you have all functions, all of these things perfectly functioning without the need for state intervention.
Yeah, I hear you, and I agree. In fact, one of the things I've written down but chose not to bring up through this was COVID shortages and things like oxygen and life-saving medication during COVID, and whether price controls there. But I felt like there as well, there were lots of examples of where people pulled up for each other as opposed to the state really making the case for a billion odd people, let's say in India. Okay,
Correct.
now
And
yeah.
those price controls just during COVID, there's so many examples, right? The government imposed price caps on masks, and luckily it was one of the most least effective policies, which is why, I mean, just take that, right? There was a mask shortage. People didn't have access to masks, and this is a real example of an emergency, because people needed almost masks to survive. And so the government did what it normally does, which is say, I'll put price caps on masks, I'll put price cap on sanitizers, right? They did that. Now, luckily, it didn't work at all, because if it had worked, then we would have never come out of COVID in the way that we did, right? I mean, assuming that, let's say, masks and sanitizers play a huge role in containing the disease, right? The otherwise, the kind of effects of that would be multiple fold if those price controls worked. Luckily, it did, because what happened?
But
Yes, there was immediately.
Yeah. No, but Anupam, here, then the question becomes, should masks be mandated? It actually segues perfectly to my next question, because the other way I wanted to put a frame around this, and maybe we shouldn't discuss masks mandation because it becomes a COVID-specific subject, is when the state imposes something, should then they also have price controls to control the monopolies that they have created? And the example, we could do masks. That's one way to do it, where the state mandates masks. Now, if I have to buy a mask and then the free market decides the price of the masks, then what the hell? I'm spending like $10 or $12 based on what the guy is saying. But it's not of my own volition that I'm buying it, right? Okay, and then, but the example I want to, I'll just finish, you can bring up both, is pharma and drugs. Because here, I can see the argument for no price controls on, let's say, I don't know, life-saving medication, right? Like I have diabetes, and this one company who's made a brilliant drug. They've taken 10 years and a few $1 billion to make it. And they now have patent on it. And the patent is a 20-year long patent, which means that the generic version of the drug cannot be produced just yet. And for those 20 years, they have a monopoly on sales. Now, this is some form of, I mean, I can see like an Engels, a Marx saying that this is cronyism in practice, right? Because what is intellectual property? And we've sort of codified into law that nobody else can make the thing that you've come up with. And now you can set price completely. So in these cases, where the state has a mandate or is providing monopoly of some sort, can they also counterbalance that by imposing price controls?
Right. So I would still say no, and very strongly so. Let's take the example of masks first. So yeah, state did impose, mask mandates. We don't need to get into the merits of the mask mandate, right? But the just the reasoning there for why an economist would say okay to mask mandate is because it's an externality, right? It's not a what you would call as the victimless crime. There's a victim here, right? If you don't wear a mask, somebody else can get hurt because of that. So therefore, because it's not a victimless crime, as against a helmet, right, which is purely a victimless crime. So mask mandates. That's the economic reasoning behind it. Whether it's effective, etc., we can go there. Now, even there, you put a price cap, it is not going to be effective. I'm only coming from the place of what is effective. If you have a particular outcome you want to achieve, and the outcome here is as many people as possible having masks, correct? That's the outcome you want to achieve. Now, if that is the outcome you want to achieve, price controls is the worst way to go about it. Because immediately, as I say, if you have price controls, all of the things that I said will come back again. You'll have shortages, you might have black markets, or you might have, you put price caps at, let's say, I don't know, whatever, 10 rupees, but it takes, in the initial period at least, because supply chains are not set, you don't know how to wear a mask. There's a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of getting new supplies, a whole bunch of things. Maybe it costs 50 rupees to produce a mask, and if that is the case and you take 10 rupees, yeah, you will still get masks at 10 rupees, but that might be just reused underwear, right? Which they're saying, sorry for that image, but they may sell that and say, oh, here you go, mask, which is not going to be effective at all, and it's going to be horrible, right? But if you want those masks to work, if you want maximum number of people to wear the mask, price controls are not the way. So what would you do then? You actually allow the market to work. And for me, the entire episode of what happened during COVID is a fantastic example of how the market can pull through. I mean, I'm so impressed. I want to use that as a case study all the time, because look at what happened, right? Look at what happened. COVID hit. Mask shortage immediately. They put a price cap. Luckily, they had no state capacity to enforce the price cap, which meant it was meaningless. Everybody was breaking the law, which was great at that point of time, right? So the mask prices went up. Mask prices going up meant it created, as I said, both an incentive and a signal. Everybody said, listen, I can make money from producing masks. You had small cottage industries, women workforce who were in textile, this thing, who were producing masks. You had, on the other hand, well-established companies like Nike, Adidas, and whatever Wildcraft, who are producing shoes and T-shirts and so on, repurposing their supply chains to produce masks, right? You had everything else in between. For me, that is a success story of how the market can pull through. There's clearly a demand, there's a signal sent out, and there's this thing. Within a period of, I don't know, a month or less than that, you had masks on, without any shortages, right? There was
But
masks
it
available.
wasn't demand so much as coercion. I mean, yes, there was demand, but the demand was coerced, right?
Sure.
Um, yeah.
But even then, I mean, okay, the demand is from coercion, but nonetheless, there was a demand, and I'm saying that demand was perfectly met, and at all price points, you could get a mask for 10 rupees, you could get a mask for 200 rupees. I have bought all of those things, right? Whatever, N95 with particular, all of those, whatever kind of features and so on, with funky prints and a plain looking blue color mask, you could get everything, and all of that, the market resolved on its own within a matter of, I know, a very short period. Even then, by the way, if you say, okay, 1 month is too long, we have to do something in between, there are better ways to do it. And I always come back to that. What is a better way to achieve the same outcome? I'm not saying, we shouldn't care about the outcome. We should care about the outcome. But what is a better way to achieve that outcome? And here is where I will still say government procurement was the answer. Government procures it even initially slightly higher price, and then, like what South Korea did, or what many other countries did, actually distribute masks free on the road initially, because that's your biggest thing that you want to achieve. That's the outcome you want to achieve. Putting a price cap would mean nobody would have a mask, or you would have to pay exorbitant amount. I mean, at one point, I remember, because there was price cap and the slightly bigger pharmacies were actually scared, they would say, sorry, we can't sell. And there's a guy right outside who's saying, I will sell you the mask, but you pay me 2x. I said, okay.
I'm still thinking through. I mean, masks is hard, but I'm still thinking through if you say government procurement, this is like an MSP situation, right? So you're saying they have to procure it slightly higher than, because it start making sense for the manufacturer. They effectively have to incentivize the manufacturer to manufacture, which 50 years ago was, we need to incentivize the farmer to create enough food to feed an entire country, which is as red line as we need masks, otherwise people will die. And then, so we set a supply price, we start buying from you. So then we've already entered the market as the largest player, as somebody who can buy masks at a certain price. And this is in a market where the price of masks are still volatile, because demand and supply are both still being gauged. People don't know how expensive it really is to make them and ship them long term. On this side, people don't know really how much to pay to buy them. And it's being coerced by the state, so a billion people need them instantaneously. So, I mean, I'm saying that either it's a libertarian first position, the state is not involved, we don't impose masks, we don't, offer patents. You do what you will, you sell it, the onus lies on the entrepreneur, and you make money and the market works freely. Or the state does intervene, but invariably there's some impact to price as a consequence of the state playing a role.
Yeah, and that's what, see, I think what I'm trying to do, which I'm surprised by myself, is to try and really take a common sense approach and not an ideological first approach, right? I'm trying to say what will work in when you have an emergency, and if the government sits back and says, I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to let the government, let the market take care of itself. I mean, it's not practical. It's not going to survive. You can be a libertarian first approach and say, no, government should not, but then you're literally written out of the conversation. And if you're written out of the conversation, you can't even make sensible recommendations. What you're going to end up doing is, you're going to have, mask mandates with price controls and something else. So I think the common sense approach is to say, okay, there is, I mean, again, I don't want to get into the merits of the mask mandate at all.
I hear you. Yeah.
let's take that as a given. Okay, the government thinks that masks are the way to stop the spread of COVID. Medically, let's say it has some value, maybe, right? And so therefore we say masks are necessary. Let's take that as a given, right? And then move on beyond that, because I want to talk about the price, not the merits of the mask mandate.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, how do you best ensure that most number of people have masks? I would still say leave it to the market. Markets can produce masks, and they have done so, etc. Now there might be an interim period where, let's say, the prices are high, many people cannot afford, and in the meantime, because they can't afford a mask, people might die. Let's take that, right? That's the line of reason. I'm saying that
Can I
is
add
where
one more to that? Sorry. Just add on is, it's also possible that to produce a mask at 3 rupees, because there is a market who's not able to pay more than 3 rupees, I make a subpar mask, which is it does not even work against that particular virus. And now technically it meets the mandate, which is you need to be wearing a mask, but it's a terrible mask. So then the state will step in and say, no, here are now a list of specifications for the mask itself, right? I hear the common sense approach, which is what I'm also saying, that price controls are a common sense response.
no, but price controls are the worst way to go about it. Price controls are the worst way. The common sense approach is to say, is there a role, at least a peripheral role for the government? I'm saying yes, but that you have to be very careful and selective in what kind of intervention you do, because you can't just say, oh, anyway, we are saying it's okay for the government to intervene, so might as well go and do this, right? No, there can be, 100 shades of gray in between, which is like my shirt, right? So there can be shades of gray in between that you can select, right? And that's what I'm saying. So you can, for example, say, okay, you leave it to the market will come through. Yes, market might produce a 3 rupees mask and a 10 rupees mask and a 200 rupees mask, but I'm saying that is okay, because again, people will select, because people will say, okay, if this is going to save my life, instead of 3 rupees, I'll spend 10 rupees, right? And so one person might be wearing a 3 rupees mask, but the fact that another person is wearing a 10 rupees mask already offers some protection. And so, again, it's that whole thing. Anyway, leaving that aside, the idea that in the interim period, let's say, you do that, I'm saying government can procure some amount of it and distribute that in government centers. And this is typically what happened as well, right? In many parts of this thing, it's not that everybody will go for a free mask, because again, there's people's preferences are very varied, right? I will not go to a crowded place to get a free mask if it means that itself I increase the risk of getting one excellent way of how the vaccines worked as well. You had government procurement of vaccines with a price cap or lowered price, and they were doing vaccines. And then initially there was a price cap on how much you could sell the vaccines to. Then, that didn't work. They removed the price cap, and then there were private hospitals. Most people who could afford said, I will go to a private hospital, pay even if it is 2x extra, because I don't want to risk, increase the risk of going to a public health care center, right? People automatically self-select, and it's good. People self-select. It means that there's more supply of vaccines at lower price for the people who truly need it. It's a wonderful case study of how markets, people, society, everybody kind of solve that problem on their own. People would give money to others to get vaccinated. Sometimes a person would give money to, let's say, their domestic help, saying, you go get vaccinated, I'll pay for you, just because they're protecting themselves, really. Or it could be out of the goodness of heart. You know what, it doesn't matter what it is for, but the fact that that thing happened as well. And so there's government providing subsidized lower price thing, there is private hospitals doing it at slightly higher prices, people self-select, and it happens. So again, in whether it's sanitizers, by the way, companies which used to produce rum started producing sanitizers. Now you can argue that rum and sanitizers are not really different, they taste the same pretty much, but but they did pivot, right? They did pivot. So
Yeah.
4 days, I think, was producing sanitizers and so on. And it's wonderful. Again, markets function with least amount of state intervention. And it's a beautiful case study. So you might just have to step in at minimally, right? At very small periods of time to tide over.
Immediately following the catastrophe, right? So you're saying that light shades of gray immediately following the catastrophe for a short duration of time is a common sense. Yeah.
That's it, right? One time you procure, distribute masks, perhaps, maybe. Even that is a maybe. I'm saying if you're finding that markets are not orienting quick enough or something, you could just, and it's also just throwing out a signal saying, listen, this is important, right? Because if you're unsure of whether, again, why would somebody not produce masks immediately? Because the producers might be unsure, saying, if I produce masks, will people really buy it? Will people actually use it? So you could throw out a signal by saying masks are mandatory, because you have done that, right? And now there's a assured demand, and people will produce those masks. Producers will pivot, so they will produce those masks. Maybe in the interim you could do some of this free distribution of masks just to completely ensure, but I don't think that's going to create distortions in the way that MSP does. MSP is a different story. It's repeated, it's ongoing, they've set prices, they're the biggest player, they're the only player. There's a whole bunch of differences between something like the MSP and something like what I'm
Yeah,
suggesting is a one-time
because
small intervention.
I get it. I was actually thinking that one of the ways to push back on this was the non-instantaneous nature of a market, because the I think the foremost critique of libertarianism is something like gradualism. It just takes a lot. It takes some time, and there are people in the interim who suffer. And what I'm hearing is that the common sense responses in a short duration, immediately following a sudden shock of some sort that was unprecedented, a light gray shade of state intervention is common sense. Broadly, yeah, but it's not as black as price controls, right? Okay, now I want to talk about the pharma drugs example, because there's no real shock that has taken place, and the monopoly is granted by way of an intellectual property or a patent. There are no other competing players. Now I've given you a monopoly and given you dictate on price, and especially in the cases of either super niche diseases where just like a couple million people have them, so I have to pay out of my nose just to get access to that. And some of them may be severely below poverty line, really struggling. A lot of diseases are specifically poor people diseases. Those exist. For example, tuberculosis is just rampant in that section of the populace who's least likely to be able to pay for continuous drugs to overcome it. And then on the other side, if it's a large enough problem, like say diabetes or something that lots of people have, then allowing you to rampantly price at, I mean, you as a company are completely comfortable with 20% of people not being able to afford it because you have 80% who do afford it. But is there some obligation on the state to say, look, I gave you a monopoly, I want you to also serve that 20%, here's a price cap?
Yeah, no. So I mean, granting a monopoly and then putting a price cap is completely ineffective. So you either don't, you should do neither, right? So you either make sure that there's competition, which will ensure that prices are lower, or you say it's okay. You can make supernormal profits in the meantime, because that's the reward for doing those long-term investments, right? So one of the two, you can't. I mean, doing both is just downright stupid, because it's like the PLI scheme equivalent, right? You give with one hand and take away with the other, which is I mean, okay. So for those of you who might be confused, the production linked incentive, you give an incentive to manufacturers to to produce something, but then you put heavy tariffs on imports of goods that they need to produce those things. So then the producers will use that money, give it back to the government as tariffs, right? So this is kind of similar. You're giving them a patent which is granted monopoly, and what do you do with a monopoly ultimately? What is a monopoly? Is not a status symbol, right? It's not something that they'll say, oh, I have a monopoly. Why do companies crave a monopoly? Because they can charge, they have pricing power. And if that you take away that pricing power through price control, it makes absolutely no sense. So that, I mean, it just creates distortions at two levels, which means higher
Hmm.
amount of leakages at two levels, higher amount of everything, rent seeking, a whole bunch of those things will happen at two levels now instead of just one. So for me, that makes no sense. But there is a real problem here, and I don't think there's a very clear answer of how to go about this, right? I'll be the first one to admit I don't have the answers, but I have maybe uh, approaches towards thinking of this. I don't think anybody is really solved for this, right? The argument for patents as such is that, again, there are things that, as you say, where there might not be a ready-made large market, or the cost benefit ratio doesn't really add up, or the gestation period is too high, the initial investment is too high, private players might not get into it, and so on. A whole bunch of reasons for why patents exist. Now, even there may be cleverer ways of doing it. So, for example, should the government instead, in some way, fund research instead of granting a patent? If that's a problem, right? I don't know if that will be less distortive. Maybe we should do experiments, or we should look at you can do studies to see whether that provides a less distortive way than a patent does. Because I would prefer that. I don't even know, I've not even thought about it really. I mean, this is a thought I literally had just now. So, but maybe that's one way to think about it. Can initial funding of research compensate for that bit, and so therefore you don't need a patent, right? And then if you do that, you can then impose control, saying if you're going to fund your research, you I don't know, you can't you're you know I don't know, maybe that's one way, but let's say patents exist, right? And you've given a government kind of blessed monopoly status for a particular company, and so now they're going to charge high, right? And just I want to probably bring in here that even a monopolist doesn't have the infinite freedom to set prices,
Of course.
right? They are still constrained by market forces, not so much as, let's say, in perfect competition, but they're still constrained, because I mean, if you charge 1 crore for a single pill, you just won't have any buyers, right? People will not buy it, so you still will respond to market conditions to some extent. So there's a limitations of how much the monopolist can charge. Given that, let's say it's still, whatever, cancer saving drugs, right? Your it's still very expensive. A lot of people might end up uh, not not being able to afford it, and therefore risk severe ill health slash fatalities because of that. And so then what do you do, right? Now, price controls again. I don't think I have to spend any more time in discussing why that will not work. Because you'll have the same set of problems. So if you put a price controls, as I said, giving a monopoly and then putting price controls will do nothing. If you know that there's going to be a price
It
control,
removes the incentive to get the patent in the first place.
exactly, they will not even invest in the research. They will not produce those drugs, which means the patent itself is useless. Nobody will get the patent, and therefore the price control is useless. So you've essentially removed a drug from the market instead of dealing with it, right? So I think that makes no sense. But then what do you do? What do you do instead? So I would again say, maybe have, if you have to intervene, and you have to be very selective about it. So right now there's something called the National List of Essential Medicines, right, which has something like 800 odd entries into it, which have price control. So basically everything is an essential medicine,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and you can argue for that, right? Can't you argue for that? Every medicine is essential.
Of
I mean,
course, but to be fair, most Indians would see no problem with this. They're super happy about the fact that we can walk into the average medical shop, and for under 1,000 or 2,000 rupees, you get most of your medicines. The whole 4-day, 5-day course is not crazy expensive. As a consequence of us being able, I mean, we're of course fairly anti WTO on some of these positions. We produce generics like nobody's business, which is actually, I'm wondering if the case is actually for no patents. I'm wondering if the case that we have to make is to say that there is cronyism in the fact that the state protects a monopoly like this, and that's fundamentally the problem.
see, again, you can argue for no patents at all, right? But then you immediately get into the other problem of, again, how do you incentivize research, which is, so these are what you would call as natural monopolies, right? Which is basically things that require heavy investment, long gestation periods, right? And at the end of it, an uncertain market. Now, again, for this equally is true of, let's say, cutting edge research. I mean, I don't know, robotics or something else, which you'd say,
Yes.
maybe people don't do it, but then, in the case of missing markets, in those cases, the impact of missing markets in those cases is relatively less, right? If a market
Hmm.
doesn't come up, whereas the impact of a missing market for essential medicines can be quite high. It's just directly death of people, right? So therefore you say, okay, you can't have a problem with missing markets. This is clearly what you would call as a again, a problem missing markets, right? So you can do all of that, but there might not be a market for the price at which it gets produced, and the gestation period is too long. That is why it's called a natural monopoly, right? And in these natural monopoly cases, the only other way to kind of solve for it apart from a patent is, again, as I said, the government slash society slash somebody bears the initial cost.
But this is
And
just a
saying,
venture capitalist, right?
yeah, we'll
Uh,
incentivize. You might have a venture capitalist, yeah, but sometimes even that might not work. Because again, because of the uncertainty of this thing, I mean, a venture capitalist will want some kind of um, bets that will pay off. Whereas, as you said, you might have a rare disease, or a disease predominantly for the poor people, right? Which so where you clearly know that even though there is demand for it, they might not be able to afford it. And so therefore in those cases, does it make sense to develop a product for that? We are already facing that, right? You don't have a lot of medicines for diseases that, let's say, some of
so
the
here,
countries with low per capita income.
My
Please.
thinking is something like this, which is, um, let's say that we didn't have patents. It would make sense for me as an entrepreneur to go after the sort of disease that nobody else is going after. If I was to go after cancer, or a type of cancer that was the most prevalent type of cancer, I know there are at least 50 other entrepreneurs trying the same thing. And one of the 50 will win, in which case they go to market first. Takes a long time for me to catch up. But if I go after a niche disease, the likelihood that I have competition here is fairly low. So I go after the niche disease. And the likelihood that somebody else will come after it later, once I've sort of built the drug and all of that, is also low. I think the only pushback to that idea would be something like, once I create it, to create a generic copy of it is really easy.
It's very
Um,
easy.
yeah.
It's very
So
easy because the cost of production. See, again, medicine is one of those things where the marginal cost of production is next to zero, right?
yes.
High fixed cost, zero marginal cost.
So it sounds like then we have to give patents for prima facie. And if that's the case, I'm not saying that we should not allow the manufacturer of this monopolized medicine to make profits. But I'm saying that, again, it's the same problem. What about the bottom 20%? In which case, maybe your answer could be something like state procurement. But
I will
there's
go
no
to state.
short-term period. There's no calamity event.
Yeah, yeah. But
It's
but
just
the only
repetitive state
answer.
procurement.
So you have two choices. If you've agreed on the setup so far that you need
Yeah.
patents, and again, those patents should be very limited, right? As in, for truly whatever innovative thing, etc. And you can't keep reproducing those patents as it currently happens. I think one of the big problems is our patent system right now is
Yes.
broken. Right, you just change one small formula, reapply for a patent, get it for another 7 years, and so on. Right, so it has to be for a limited period of time, which is very exclusive, and you can't, reissue those patents, etc. I'm not a patent lawyer, very far from it, but at least I know what is not working. But
Yeah.
I'm sure we can figure out how to make that work, right? But and 5 years is a reasonable amount of time. Yes, prices might be high in those 5 years. Maybe some market will, some people will produce it. Yeah, in the interim, something might happen, but after that, you will get competition, and then it becomes normalized, right? So that's the hope. So even in that interim period, I would say yes, you can have, a policy of state procurement in that period, and then say, okay, I will only, distribute it in government hospitals. And so immediately you've created a barrier for, let's say, rich people to come and take advantage of that, right? Because they will not go to government hospitals. So you create some kind of those barriers, and you be very selective in how you target those things, and so on. So it is state intervention. You're not getting away from state intervention. Can you choose the least distortive way of doing that state intervention? So you're saying there is a market failure. Here, in this case, there is a market failure. Once there is a market failure, identify the correct kind of market failure, identify the correct kind of state response to it, which is the least distortive state response, which maybe it's state procurement, maybe something else, somebody else can come up with it. That's my answer, is maybe state procurement.
Yeah.
You could think of vouchers, for example, direct
Yeah.
subsidies to the people. You give a subsidy to the person who's, let's say, who qualifies for a certain criteria, and say, okay, then you can go to any treatment and get it. I don't know how exactly to do it. I mean, you have to do, RCTs, you might have to do a little bit of things to figure out what is the most effective way, but finding the least distortive method is important, and then making sure that that is governed properly, that is effective, whole bunch of those things, right? It goes into implementation issues, which you don't need, but at least from a conceptual framework, I would say this is the way to approach it.
So, got it. I'm going to try and like build one more dichotomy here, just to. I want to get to the heart of your motivations, okay? And I'll use minimum wage as an example. So,
But can I,
yeah, sure,
Deepak,
sure, yeah.
before you go there, since we're on medicine, right? Can I spend like maybe 5-10 minutes to, as I said, show how deep the 5 minutes
Discuss tents. Super. Then let
stents?
me ask this as a question. I mean, it applies here as well, right? So when you're saying something like we should allow state procurement for those, I mean, you're at least saying there's a light shade of gray here that's reasonable. It seems to come from a very moral place. You're saying that I don't want to live in a sort of society where somebody's dying because they're not able to buy the over-the-counter medication, just because as an economist it makes sense for a market to work. Yeah, that a market does not say to the needs of some people, given this whole patent and monopoly, etc., is understandable. And there, I think the state should somewhat step in, right? And the question is, there are two first principles. The first is I believe in freedom and don't like coercion, right? And that's sort of the answer to why a free market should exist, because I don't want to be coerced into anything, a price floor, a price ceiling, a subsidy, nothing of the sort, right? Even something like taxation would come into question. I don't want to be coerced. And on the other side, we say something like we want the best outcomes for the most number of people. At the start of the podcast, you said a great market is one that delivers that, the highest choice for most number of people. Now, very often they overlap. right? Which is great, because then we don't have to really get to the heart of which we would pick if we had to pick one. But the question is something like, in instances where, if it were hypothetically the case, that we could not produce the best results with a free market, is some degree of coercion justified? Would we be willing to let go of that first principle on, I don't want to be coerced as an individual, to better increase those market outcomes? Of course, I mean, I'd love to go into stents. I don't know if this can be drawn as a parallel, or we can put a pin in this and come back with minimum wages. But with the patents question, that's what I was thinking, which is, it seems like you're saying that it's not always a freedom first. Sometimes a little bit of coercion is fine, but I'd rather live in a world where the poorest of the poor can get something, even if it means the state intervening in light shades of gray.
Correct. And I think, I mean, I know, again, depends on, this is an ideological question, right? So you might have somebody take an extremist ideology and say, see, for me, I think I come from, I will try to maximize utility. So I'm a utilitarian that way, maximum utility, highest utility for the maximum number of people, with the least amount of coercion. And I think, as you said, in most cases, those two things overlap, because the least amount of coercion usually leads to the best outcomes for the maximum number of people. Right, but again, it's least and it's not zero coercion, because
I hear you.
Because when you've signed the social contract, you've already agreed to a particular amount of coercion, and that's a trade-off we've already made, because that's the only thing that can give us rights for other things. Right?
Yes.
So we've already agreed to the principle that we are okay to trade off a little bit of our liberties for maximizing the liberties for all. Right? Because if I was the strongest person in the room, I would argue for zero state intervention. So therefore, not even the social contract, because I have the biggest gun in the room, or I have the biggest. Okay, no, let's be realistic, right? I can't have the biggest muscles in the room. So let's be realistic. I have the biggest gun in the room. I would argue for zero state intervention, because then it's the rule of the law. It's Matsya Nyaya. I big fish eat small fish, and I'm the biggest fish there. But we've already agreed that in order to have some kind of justice and recourse to justice, we have signed this thing called the social contract, right? Where we've given up a little bit of our rights, so right for violence, for example, that I just shoot you dead and take all of your money. I've already given up my right to do that and saying, okay, I will not do that, but then equally the state protects all my other rights. So we've done that. So even in this case, I think it's just an extension of that. It is making kind of moral compromises to ensure the maximum utility for most in the least coercive possible manner. And we have to find that thing. And so as a society, I mean, now again, you can argue, you can decide where you want to lie. We could go for a completely non-welfarist libertarian kind of society, saying, I don't care if people die if they don't have the money. Right? That's a position you can take. Maybe it's a valid position, but that's a position you can take. I will not take that position. I will say, okay, I want to live in a society where people don't, I mean, as much as possible, as much as we can help it, people don't die because of lack of access to whatever it is, healthcare, to medicine, or whatever it is. So if that is a position that, let's say, some of you at least who are listening to this can relate to, then I would say this is the best possible compromise that exists, right? So you are putting this in the moral compass, to say that we've decided that we are a kind of welfare-oriented society, maybe not welfare in the sense that we'll give out everything for free, but at least we will prevent the avoidable deaths. Maybe that's one way to put it. Endeavor to prevent avoidable deaths, right? That's what this is. And so if that is a position that you resonate with, then this is one of the best ways to take it. So yes, you are saying a little bit of coercion, because whenever we say state, even procurement, forget price controls, that's very far away, right? That's maximum coercion. Least coercion is procurement. And why the coercion there? Because once the state procures, it has to finance it. That financing comes through taxation. So you're saying okay to taxation. That's already the kind of principle we have agreed upon. That's not the principle. That's the mechanism that we are saying, okay, that's the way to do it, right? So you do taxation. Taxation means coercion, but then you use those taxation to prevent market failures, right? And increase this aspect of it. So it's the least coercive way to achieve maximum utility.
Understood. Okay. Now to stents. So you can treat me and practically everybody listening to this as new to the subject. How do stents relate to price controls, and what's broken?
Okay, so this is just a case study, right? Because the reason I'm fascinated by this is just to see what kind of unintended consequences actually come about, right? So in 2017, the we have something called the NPPA, the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Agency, which is what sets this national list of essential medicines, right? So they came in saying, people are, heart diseases are a problem in India, right? A lot of people dying out of coronary related problems, and so therefore they said, and one of the popular kind of solutions to that is stents, and they said stents are too expensive, and therefore we will put a price cap on stents, right? So their price cap was of course ridiculous. It resulted in like an 85% drop in the prices for certain varieties of stents, right? But for our purpose, let's keep it simple. There are two kinds of stents. What is a stent, by the way? A stent is basically a mesh kind of tube which is inserted into the artery which leads up to the heart, because that's usually blocked and that prevents the blood flow. So you kind of just open it up by putting a tube, right? Now there are various kinds of these stents. These can be drug eluting stents, so that will have drugs which will kind of make sure that it's open. It could be just a bare metal stent, which is just basically a metal tube, right, which keeps it open. So you can have different varieties of this. So the bare metal stent, by the way, was roughly costing something like 45,000, and they put a price cap saying you can't charge higher than 7,200. Okay, I'm removing the second decimal points, etc. Right, and the drug eluting stents usually cost about 1.2 lakhs, if I remember correctly, and they put the price cap around 29,000 or 29,600 odd. Okay, so massive price drops, as you can see, right? Now, what happened because of that? A whole bunch of consequences happened immediately, as one can expect. Shortages. So many of the big stent manufacturers, or the big stent manufacturer are three companies in the US. You have Abbott Chemicals, Medtronic, and Boston Scientific. Okay, so these are the three big things. They just basically reduced the distribution of stents to India. In just that year, when the price caps were put, they reduced it by 14%. And then later, subsequent years as well, they kept reducing this. So you clearly have shortages, right? Now, once you have these shortages, by the way, there was still a demand for it. Demand didn't go away, and so that part of that demand, which was left kind of unmatched by supply from the US manufacturers, Chinese manufacturers came in, and these Chinese manufacturers, they could adhere to the price cap. It also meant that they were of very poor quality.
Yeah.
Right, so you've reduced supply, you've lowered the what do you say, the quality of those stents. So okay, the reason why I'm going into this is that, as we were doing with the milk example, right, it's not that there's only one effect that'll take place, because the market is big enough that you'll have multiple such effects going on, right? So part of it is supply shortage. The second part of it is still another bit, which is basically the cost of complementary goods, right?
Yes.
So immediately, and there was this beautiful case study. If I remember correctly, there was either an Outlook or an India Today kind of study which was done, basically an observation, really, that as soon as this went up, the cost of surgery went up. So they're saying stents is still at 29,600, but the surgery, because that
Of course.
involves doctors and there's no price cap on that, that just shot up, right? It just clearly just complemented, and then a needle, if you were to buy even a syringe, right? The syringe which was used for, let's say, any other operation would be much lower than if you were using it for a coronary operation, right? So I mean, all of these things happen. The room rent for a stent operation was very different from a room rent for a broken arm,
Yeah.
right? And so on and so forth. And then you had a whole bunch of these things. You can imagine, right? Hospitals are clever. They wouldn't be where they are if they were not clever. They know how to kind of beat such basic kind of systems, right? So they did all of that bit. That's the second, or I don't know, third or fourth kind of this thing. The big consequence of this, which many people don't know, is that India at that point of time, 2018, 2019, India was thrown out of the generalized system of preferences of the US, GSP, right? Which gave market access to the US at very low tariff rates compared to the rest of the world, and we got removed from it because, as a retaliatory measure, because we put price caps on cents. I mean, you have to know that that's also a consequence, right? Nobody will add those things up, but if you read what happened there, this is what happened. Okay, so these are standard effects that you can think of, but I want to just focus on one case study, right? There's a study by somebody called Dio and some of his colleagues, or her colleagues, I'm not even sure of the gender of the person, by their colleagues, and this was basically a study done to see what was the relative use of two kinds of, let's say, surgeries that you could do for somebody with a coronary disease, right? So you could do something called a PTCA, right, which is basically angioplasty, or a CABG, which is bypass graft. Okay, so PTCA is where angioplasty is where you basically insert the stent, and bypass graft is
Yeah.
basically where you take, I think, a well-functioning artery from somewhere else and place it. Is that correct? Okay, so
Yeah, that sounds right to me completely. As a doctor myself.
right. Well, but anyway, these are the two options, and if I know correctly, the generally the bypass graft is a better option for patients who are under 51 years of age, where it's not an emergency and so on, right? It's clearly the better option. Yet most hospitals started overprescribing or overdoing the PTCA, the angioplasty, after this particular price control. How? Now, even though angioplasty had used stents and stents had price control, yet hospitals preferred to do more stent operations than bypass operations, right? The reason being, hospitals had negotiated long term insurance rates with insurance companies
Hmm.
based on the earlier prices. So let's say the earlier the price was whatever, right? As I said, 1.2 lakhs. That is the rate at which they would have negotiated with the insurance companies. So they would get 1.2 lakhs for performing a stent operation. But now they could actually procure it at 29,000. That was a huge profit to be made. So they wanted to do more and more and more of stent operations, right? Because they could eat the difference, right? And so the number of cases which were labeled as emergency to justify the use of stents shot up. So you could go in for a routine checkup. They'll say, listen, you're just about to die. You're very lucky that you came in now, because 2 minutes later you would have died, and so now let's just do the angioplasty, right? And they would do the angioplasty. So number of cases which, there are studies, the number of angioplasty cases shot up, the number of cases diagnosed as heart whatever problems and emergencies shot up, and so they would do this. So you clearly can see how, these are the range of effects of
Yeah.
price controls. People's lives are in danger. So if you're doing, let's again circle back. The very purpose of doing this was to, save people, right? And
Yes.
to, make it accessible. What you've done is actually put people's life at risk. That's the correlation. I'll stop with that.
And
There's lots of other nuances, but this is just to give you a very quick kind of thing of what happens when you mess with prices.
no, and perhaps it's fair because the morality of policy, it feels like, should be measured by outcome and not intention.
Yeah.
And so we stand fairly square there. Okay, so
Minimum wages.
yeah, but I'm not so thrilled on minimum wages anymore, because for me that was the primary question, right? If you could prove that minimum wages make outcomes better for certain societies in the medium term, let's say, and there has been economic literature around this. There are many instances where minimum wages have been imposed and it has not wreaked havoc on that particular economy. Now, perhaps you would argue that it's not a long enough window of observation, because some of these are longer term impacts. But if it were such a case that you could pass some sort of a limitation on labor price in this example, and that implies that there is a floor or a ceiling, in this case a floor that you cannot be below, and economic outcomes for that society or that group of people improves, would you still be against minimum wages? And the reason I ask this question is not particularly minimum wages, but rather seeking intention. Do you have a problem fundamentally with state coercion? And gladly it overlaps with better economic outcomes, so here we are. Or is it that I'm on the side of better economic outcomes even if that means state coercion? So that was the question I had asked earlier as well. But in the context of minimum wages, sometimes better placed, simply because there's at least some data showing that minimum wages have in short to medium term time frames done well for some societies.
Yeah, I think, see, the literature is kind of divided on this. Okay, it
Yeah.
doesn't very clearly tell you what the answer is, but if I was to again employ a first principles approach, minimum wages leads to excesses, right? The minute that you have maximum something, you have shortages. The minute you have minimum, it leads to excesses. Okay, that's
Yeah.
for most people, you have to remember that. So when you have minimum wages, it leads to basically excesses. That is more supply of labor than what is required, and less actually demand for that labor, right? So now in minimum wages, I think the minute you have minimum wages, you will have unemployment, greater kind of unemployment, greater people who are not employed, because, well, you've increased the price at which the thing, so demand falls but supply is more, right?
Yes.
So that's the immediate effect of minimum wages. And then there are a whole bunch of other things, like as we said, black market here
Yeah.
is
So, but I'm pulling you back to that question. If it were the case that the imposition of minimum wage in some subset of society somewhere, due to some strange collection of factors, did make society better off, it did improve economic choice.
again, what do you
I'm
mean
just
society?
driving at motivation.
What do you mean society better off, right? So my point is this. My point is this, right? Minimum wages does make a certain set of people better off. That is, the people who are already employed, it'll make them better off. It will make the people worse off who are not employed.
So
And so
let's say, I
therefore,
mean, when I mean better off, I just mean that employment let's say unemployment numbers become better. There is less and less people are unemployed after the imposition of minimum wages. Now,
I'm
don't
not
ask me
sure.
how theoretically happens. Sure, I hear you, right? Fair enough. Which is why it's a hypothetical question, because the question I'm asking is not about price controls. It's about what is or what is driving the belief in price controls. Is it a non-interventionist state that is fundamentally important, or is it society better off as a consequence?
No, I think ultimately it's about economic. Ultimately it's about outcomes. It's about, I'm not an ideologue, right? I'm not an
Hmm.
ideologue at all. I think I care about outcomes the most. If So I care about what gives the best utility for the maximum number of people with the least amount of distortions. And the only place where I would take some kind of ideological kind of the thing is the thing about individual liberty, right? That I should have liberty. So if, for example, minimum wage in this, but I can't even say it, Deepak. If minimum
So
wage has no consequences whatsoever and
uh-huh.
makes everybody better off, you know what? Okay, let's see. But I can't even say that because I know that not to be true. Because at the least, what you're doing is coercing people to pay more. So on one end, you're coercing people to pay more. The minute you coerce somebody to pay more than what they think is the value there, they will employ basically other methods to get around it. Now, it could be just that they employ more contractual labor. It could be that they just replace machinery.
Yeah.
Yeah, humans with machinery, and so on and so forth. And I'm yet to see conclusive evidence either way that will not happen, right? So even as a joke or to indulge you, I can't get into this hypothetical to say this thing because to me those two things are married to each other. It can't be divorced from each other. That basically you have a situation where uh, maximizing freedom and individual liberty and minimizing state intervention leads to better outcomes for most people. For me, those two things are not different from each other, right? Now, you could see again, as I said, as a society you can decide saying, maybe, right, you can decide, I will not agree, but as a society, and I'm not single, right? As a society, you can decide saying, I'm okay with the idea of that some people might be unemployed as long as the people who are employed get a decent living wage. That's a trade-off that society can
Yeah.
make and therefore get passed into law, etc. But I want everybody to be completely aware of that trade-off that they're making. You can't wish it
Yeah.
away. That's the trade off you're making. So, therefore, all forms of labor laws, all forms of minimum wages and other kinds of labor laws are very clearly saying, I want the people who are already employed to have a better life, to have a better whatever this thing, than the people who are not employed. So, you're very clearly picking winners. Okay, if that's what you want to do, you
Sure.
live with
No, and I didn't bring the example up at all for price controls because yes, minimum wages are a tax on the unemployed, right? Sure. I mean that's a clear train of thought that one can make on paper. But okay, maybe the example is not best to bring this up. One final thing, which is in sort of trying to read through and find loopholes in the whole, you know, which is by the way brutal to do because you're putting me on the other side of price controls or putting myself on the other side of price controls and with an economist on the other side. I found a very interesting example which is non-state price controls. Okay, so I'm going to lay it out for you and for the listeners, and then you can tell me which side you lean. All right. um, there exists a manufacturer of a good. Let's say, for example, that this good is a really premium leather bags, right? And the manufacturer is intending to set out and build a product that is a premium leather brand product. The manufacturer signs a contract with the distributor saying that there is a floor price on the product itself. That is, you have to sell this bag, for example, at 10,000 rupees and above, cannot be sold below that because the whole point of this chain or this brand is that it's premium leather bags. It can't be seen sold at 2,000 rupees, right? The manufacturer, so the distributor or the retailer agree, they sign the contract, and then um, a year later, the manufacturer finds out that in fact there is one retailer who is retailing this product at significantly below the floor price that was agreed upon in contract. Right now, this gets taken to court. where the retailer says that, look, that it is what's the right word for it? Illegal is probably a good word, but immoral, let's say, for the manufacturer to even have that clause in the contract, right? To even have a floor price dictated on me is immoral. Okay, now what is the split? On one side, you have the sanctity of the word and the handshake. You and I are doing business. We shook hands. You told me you would sell my good or product at 10,000 rupees, and you should. That's just what a contract is, right? It's a handshake. On the other side, you have the sanctity of private property, which is I bought that handbag. It is now mine. Once it is within my dominion and ownership, you are no one to tell me whether I can or cannot sell it, whether I can wear it or give it away at 5 rupees. It is my private property, right? If you were to arbiter on this, not at all being a lawyer, just from first principles, which side would you pick?
I mean, so first principles, I would say that the person who's selling the bags, the manufacturer of the bags, has every right to try and put that in the contract. They can try and put anything in the contract, right? Because that's also part of the freedom.
Yeah.
They should have the freedom to try and put anything in the contract. If I was a retailer, I would not sign that contract, right? And the retailer should say, no way. I mean, I'm not going to sell this contract. As you say, I mean, I will completely say, once I've bought that thing from you, I can sell it at any rate I want. They should have that freedom, right? And so they should not sign the contract. If they've signed the contract, I think they have to abide by it, because again, this is a private contract that they've come up with. Nobody is coercing them, right? There's complete lack of coercion here. You have complete freedom to sign that contract or not. If you sign the contract, you have to abide by it. I would say don't sign the contract in the first place. Don't ever, I mean, why would you agree to those terms? And then let the manufacturer do whatever they want. Now, if the manufacturer truly wants that outcome, that it's not sold, they have to sell it at 10,000 rupees. They sell to the retailer at 10,000 rupees to make sure that the retailer sells about 10,000 rupees, right? Just
Sure.
so that, again, believe in the private interest of that retailer. Now, it so happens that, let's say, nobody buys it, they will sell it at a loss, but then that company will anyway go down, right? And then it's done. So for me, this is fairly simple case. It's the contract can be legal, as in they should have the freedom to enforce such a contract. The retailer should have the freedom not to enter into such a contract, but once they do, they should abide by it, because that's the sanctity of the contract.
So I mean, prima facie, that was my take as well, just listening to it. But in reading, I think, and this is a real case. The whole leather bags case is an actual case that went to the Supreme Court in the US, and then later was brought up in a secondary case to do with a medical company or pharma company, if I'm not wrong. And I'll tell you about the Supreme Court's decision, or the United States Court's decisions as a consequence. But what struck me was, even if I had put that in contract, so you and I had signed a contract. Now, I don't know. Intuitively, I feel that, of course, we shook hands on this. You said you would not retail at below 10,000 rupees, and you just shouldn't, because we shook hands on this, right? But is that handshake abiding by law is the question. So that is, if I were to go to court and say, I now want to sell this bag at 8,000 rupees, can the court say something like, no, you're not allowed to sell the bag at 8,000 rupees because it is my bag? And the fact that it violates a contract means that you place the contract in that hierarchy above the value of private property. You're saying that my private property still stands governed as a consequence of the contract.
Yeah, but that is fair. Because in the contract, you're giving up that right to whatever, that private property, right? In that sense, you're saying, once you sign the contract, for me, that is the same, because you're voluntarily giving up that right to say, I the freedom to set the price that I want.
That's interesting. Okay, so the strange thing is that, or the funny thing is that, the Supreme Court, or I don't know which court it went to, but it's been used a bunch of times, has taken the exact opposite position, which is that a floor price in private contracts is illegal. That is, no manufacturer can even place into contract a floor price on a retailer or distributor, because that is fundamentally their private property. But this coming from the United States, where one of the things that they hold supreme is private property, at least in principle, right? And so I think that they simply lean that way, from my limited legal understanding, because they think that private property is absolute, and to have dictates on what you should or should not do with private property, once you own it, whatever that word means, you own it in its truest sense, cannot have strings attached, is the approximate
But
position.
I think, but then you're placing right to property at a higher level than whatever right to freedom, because you're taking away that person's freedom to enter into such a contract.
Right. And I also think that when you use the word price controls, you simply mean state legislated price controls, not what you and I agree as a price for
Yeah,
selling by, right?
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
because that
Right.
does not
So
skew a
this,
market; it simply skews the one particular good or service.
yeah, but so there, I think now we're right into that territory where we can talk about MRP, which is
Yeah.
the maximum retail price, which is a very interesting thing because maximum retail price is a price control which is set by the wholesaler on the retailers,
Yes.
but that is given government backing. Right. So where the problematic bit is that all of this is blessed by the government or by the state. Right. So for me, that is the problematic bit. So if you purely had one manufacturer saying you have to sell it at this rate, you can't sell it higher, and somebody agrees to that, I'm okay with it. But now the fact is that they're not agreeing to it voluntarily, but the state is imposing that you have to abide by whatever retail price that the manufacturer said. So if the manufacturer says you have to sell it at whatever, right, a packet of biscuits at 10 rupees, the retailer cannot sell it at 11 rupees, right? And you made it a criminal offense, you made it a punishable offense, cognizable offense, whatever, right? And so for me, that immediately again is back into the same territory of deeply problematic, distortive state intervention.
I don't know if I fully understand. So, is the problem that price is arrived at in collusion with the state? Because if you and I were to sign a contract and I were to set a floor price on you retailing my product, that's fine by you, right? You're saying that look, once you sign it, whether you should sign it a separate question, but if you're the sort of person who does sign it, then if I say you have to sell my bag at 1,000 rupees or 10,000 rupees, you must sell it at 10,000 and above. That we agree on from, I mean, or you think that that's the way it ought to work. And if it were violated, you and I should be able to go to court. So the state should back, in this worldview, should back the
Contract.
floor price that we have set. Right? It should say that look, a signed contract is a signed contract. You must abide by it, and you can't change it. What's the difference between that and an MRP? Is it the collusion?
This
Collusion?
one, I mean, so that I don't know, the whatever the bag thing is, a firstly it's a one-off. I mean, it's just that there's one product with somebody's, the single retailer, etc. Here you're talking about one manufacturer, 100 million retailers, right? That scale matters. And then that one wholesaler is selling, or whatever producer is setting the price for all of these things, and the state is backing it. It's not a one-on-one kind of contract that they've gotten into, and the retailers have not really agreed to it, but it's a law, it's a mandated thing that you have to take that as a give or take, right? I mean, if you give an option to the retailers, they will not even take it. So I think the complete lack of choice on on the part of the retailer, and because it's for every good, so you can't just say, oh, I mean, with the bag, I can just say the retailer will not sell that manufacturer's bag if they have that condition. They can just sell, I don't know, if this is they can sell B's bag, right? But here,
Yeah.
every single manufactured product has a MRP. So it's for everything. They don't have the choice. So on those two counts, it's very different, right? The complete lack of choice makes the big difference.
So,
I took
for me and viewers, I think just one level deeper is, as a manufacturer today, if I'm selling something, I want to think of a non-unionized product. So let's say I'm selling bicycles, perhaps, right? Something like that. Uh, how does a manufacturer decide MRP, and does it need to be ratified, okayed by the state before I'm
no,
able
it
to
does.
print and publish?
So it
It
doesn't,
doesn't.
right? The manufacturer can choose whatever they want as the MRP. So I mean, in
Right.
that sense, at least good. The state is not interfering in that part yet. They can just choose whatever MRP. But once they say this is MRP, there is a whatever division of metrology. I don't know what it is, but there is a government department which looks at this, and they say, okay, this is the MRP, right? And then the adherence to that MRP is enforced by the government,
But
right?
then
So
I see
whatever
no
MRP.
difference because I am free to pick an MRP. The distributor retailer is free to do business with me. They could choose not to do business with me, but that means choosing not to do business at all, because every good and serves. Okay, so the key difference seems like the mandatory imposition of some MRP, as opposed to you choosing whether you want to place an MRP on the product. That's
Exactly.
the key difference.
Exactly, right? So now when you have a producer who says, okay, this is the, I mean, even there, right, even the producer is forced to do that MRP thing.
Yes.
They might not want to. They might just say, this is my product, I will sell it to you at this price. You can then go sell it at whatever price. In fact, they might want the retailers to have the freedom to sell it at a lower price based on discounts and to clear inventory, or might sell it at a higher price based on demand and get a higher profit so that they buy more from the retail. In
Right.
fact, the manufacturer and the producer themselves do not like the MRP, but they're forced to set up, because then now you're setting an anchor price, and that anchor price might not, it might not be good. I mean, that's not something that they'd want even, right? So that's the problem, right? And what is the problem with MRP? I mean, one, apart from the fact that it rarely works, two, you're completely ignoring all forms of that people's preferences are different, that circumstances are different, and so on, right? How can you say that the Maggie that you buy in Bangalore in the shop next door in MG Road, where there's like 100 million shops, all conveniences, you can buy it, that's at 10 rupees, as against, let's say, a packet of Maggie that you might buy in on top of a mountain in Himachal, right, where there's so much more transportation cost, there's so much more, this logistical nightmare that you have to get. I mean, and you're saying both have to be priced at the same this thing. It's absolutely ridiculous.
It's predictable, and perhaps that's what they're optimizing for, which is that
Keep a straight face when you say that, Deepak. Let's see.
no, but no, but I mean, I hear you. Actually, just to close the loop on the previous point, the MRP point. Yeah, I think that by and large, the difference between the legal case, which is the handbags case, and this is just that the state mandates every manufacturer to have an MRP. But you would be fine if manufacturers self-selected into groups who wanted to impose an MRP on their retailers, distributors, as long as those retailers signed into the contract of their own volition. So price controls imposed, and that should be backed by the state, right? Of course.
Yeah, once you enter into a contract, then contract enforcement is part of the this thing of the courts, right, and the state. So that they should do. But I mean, I will argue that the handbag case is an extremely rare one, because we have to put that in context. Most manufacturers will not want to get into any such contract, because they will want a price system which works for them and which will maximize their sales. Now, that would mean having the flexibility to, as I said, increase the price when the demand goes up and decrease the price when there's no demand for inventory clearance, right? So most manufacturers, I would say 99.9% of manufacturers, will want the flexibility in price. Apart from, let's say, a Ferrari, right? They want that exclusivity. They want that, they have lots of rules on who can get it. But that's one in literally a million products. Right, that's one in a million products. Most manufacturers will not want anything like to get into such contracts, right? Because I think that context is important. We shouldn't think that this is a commonplace thing, everybody wants it, and so whether Anupam supports it or not, right? It's not.
Sure, fair enough. I think we're about an hour and 40 minutes in, and the final question I attempt to end with always is to switch roles. So we've done an hour and 40 minutes of me attempting to poke holes at the whole price control position. If you were in my shoes, and I were in yours, which is easily switchable, and I were to say that no, we should have absolutely no centralized price controls, how would you, what is the best good faith case for price controls in some economy?
I refuse to take part in this.
And you know what I'm hoping for? I'm hoping for this snippet to go viral. Just Anupam saying, here are cases where price control is justified, with no context.
Yeah, no, but honestly, okay, now that you asked it, honestly, I can say that I cannot imagine a single scenario where where price control is the best possible solution available. I can't imagine
subsidies.
Sorry,
not even subsidies.
No, but I mean, subsidy is not equivalent to price control.
Right.
So I'm saying there always exists a better solution for the same outcomes that you want. And when I say a better solution, I mean a less coercive solution, right? A less coercive solution. There always exists a less coercive solution than a price control, because price control for me, so in order of government intervention, right, at least in the market, you have bans, and right below that you have price controls. It's extreme form of government intervention and distortion. So I cannot think, and then historical evidence tells us that there is not a single place where price controls have worked. And when I say have worked, as in delivered the desired outcome without massively distorting the entire market. There's not a single place that's worked.
Given
so
that you have that hierarchy, maybe if I were in your place to make a steelman, I'd say, in any case where the state wants to ban something, do a price control instead.
but it
Then
amounts to more. Yeah, maybe, but it amounts to more or
because
less.
it's better than a ban.
Yeah, maybe, but you see that I'm not saying it. So
Yeah, I hear you. But thank you
I
very
see.
much for coming on.
This,
Yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah,
the final thing that I want to say, right? There are very few things that I take in kind of an extremist position
yeah.
in economics, because there's a lot of nuance, even on bans, by the way. Even on bans, I don't take an extremist position. For example, um, I will say that maybe bans of extreme hard drugs is justified. Now, you don't have this, of course, no state has a state capacity to enforce it, which is why you have to be very selective. So you might say, okay, I will not ban weed, but I might ban, I don't know, meth, right? And then, yeah, with acknowledging that you can't completely win over that ban, there will be some leakage, but a ban is better than no ban, right? So even there I will say, okay, a ban is okay, it's justified because it's also sending out a signal, it's also doing all of those things. Regulation, I will say some places, you need regulation for a whole bunch of things. So I don't take extremist positions there saying, oh, no regulation is required, right? On most of these things I will say, yes, there's again the common sense approach, but only it's in price control that I can say with so much certainty that price controls have never ever worked, never. And it takes a lot for me to say it in such definitive terms, because you have to be tentative, and I'm generally tentative about a whole bunch of things, saying we have to look at the evidence and so on, but all the evidence I've looked at, I can't find a single instance where price controls have worked, or that there doesn't exist a better way to deal with it.
So for viewers listening, watching, if you have evidence that price controls have worked somewhere that I've missed in my reading, that Anupam has missed in his extensive reading, send it to us, and I'm sure he'd love to see it. I'd love to see it as well. Um, Anupam, thank you very much for joining in. I appreciate your time so much.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that we got to do this at this kind of this level of detail and nuance. I mean, I don't know, we might have bored the pants of some people, but uh, because these are such nuanced topics, right? As I said, if I could have done this in 5 minutes, price controls bad, no evidence, and ended it. But then to justify it each and every time on all of those
Yeah.
scales that you mentioned, right? What about when people are dying? Will you still not support price controls there? And for me to actually try and justify that, saying no, I will not, because it results in more people dying, right? So you take the same scale, not change the goalposts, and not bring in, it's okay, people die, but freedoms are increased. No, you have to take the same thing and say, even in those situations, price controls don't help, because more people will die with price controls than without. And then trying to, look at how those things played out. For me, it was a fascinating intellectual exercise. So thank you for having me over.
Thank you very much for your time, Anupam.